Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me to this, because I think this is actually a hugely important discussion. And I'm absolutely delighted that it's being brought out now, and I believe that it really should be discussed in many, many more forums, not just here. Uh, Also because of the timing. I mean, I think Eva Jolie mentioned that this is a time where, really it's urgent because this is sort of running out. But I think the timing is very important also because this is in the context of two other very big international discussions that are taking place. There's this huge thing about the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, which has been going on forever, and which at the moment anyway seems to be this big laundry list of items that all developing countries must fulfill. I think there may be 85 of them by now, which cannot be done without resources. And to expect even one of these things to be met without significant addition of public resources is, I believe, completely misplaced, unlikely, and ridiculous. So the issue of where this is to come from is huge. Then there is a whole discussion about climate change, which we all know is a serious threat, and the issue of climate resources. Where are we going to find the resources to deal with adaptation, mitigation, and reduction of the things that affect climate change? And once again, it's rather silent. In other words, the discussion skirts around this critical issue of finding the resources. And then third, there is this, well, in a sense, bringing both of these together, there is a big discussion on the financing for development. And in fact, there's going to be a big conference in Addis Ababa in July, which again is talking about how to find resources for all these things. But surprisingly, the issue of the really low-hanging fruit, the stuff that is all out there and just has to be picked, is not mentioned. So the financing for development discussion is all about getting private sector involved, doing their corporate responsibility, being kind and generous through public-private partnerships to somehow finance development. It's seen as this voluntary act that we should encourage them to do and give them incentives to do. And clearly, in all of these things, whether it is SDGs or it is the climate resource change, dealing with climate change, or it is financing for development more broadly, the basic point should be for corporates that, fine, do your corporate social responsibility and all of that, but first begin by paying your taxes. Let's just begin with that part. And I think the potential here is absolutely huge. There is an UNCTAD study, which I think is also mentioned here, that the potential losses for just developing countries from just corporate tax losses is about $100 billion a year. It sounds like a large number. I don't think it is, because in our own country, we have estimates for just India losing about $4 or $5 billion a year from corporate taxes, which, if you add to that the fact that the wealthy of the world have lots of fancy asset managers who can ensure that they too do not pay taxes, etc., means that we are really giving up on massive resources, which are, in fact, our entitlement if we really do wish to develop the global economy, if we really do wish to achieve, forget social justice, just minimum transformation and economic diversification across, the populations of the world. So I think this is a very important discussion, and I really hope that this is brought to all of these different fora and made with a much, much louder voice, because I think it's critically important. I just want to give one example from India because I happen to know it, and because I think it captures many of the points that were made earlier about various issues I think Jose Antonio also raised and Professor Stiglitz also raised. In India, we have a double taxation agreement with Mauritius, which means that Mauritius, just like Luxembourg, right? Mauritius is the largest foreign investor in India. Something like 40% of foreign investment comes from Mauritius. And most of it comes from companies that are all in one building. So it's quite an active company out there. It has some, 3,500 companies exist in that building, and all of them are doing investment in India. Vodafone, the British multinational, recently bought up an Indian company, Hutchison, Whampoa, which was part Singapore, etc., and took over 1/3 of the Indian mobile telephone market. They did this in a transaction that they claimed was done in Mauritius, because one subsidiary of Hutchison Whampoa has an office there, Vodafone has an office there, they did it over there. The Indian government last year, 2 years ago, I'm sorry, tried to tax this transaction with the usual capital gains, etc. taxes, arguing that, listen, this whole thing happened in India. The seller was an Indian entity, the buyer is an Indian entity, this is an Indian transaction, you should pay the tax. The tax loss is estimated to be $1.4 billion. To give you one sense of how much that is in the Indian case, this would pay for the entire ICDS program, Integrated Child Development Scheme, which covers maternal and child nutrition, pregnant lactating mothers and infants up to the age of 3 for 1 year. This would pay for 1/3 of our Rural Employment Guarantee Act for that year. 1/3, which is across India, which employs something like, in that particular year, it employed it created 445 million work days. No, more than that, 450 million work days, okay? It would have paid for 1/3 of that. It is double the total amount that the government of India spends on the National Health Mission, which is a scheme to ensure public health access across rural India. So that's the kind of money for one transaction, one particular tax loss. Okay, massive outcry when the Indian government said it was going to do this. First, they said it's retrospective. This happened 4 years ago. How dare you tax us now? You should have taxed us, told us about it then. It's too late. Retrospective is out of the question. So lots of jumping up and down about retrospective. Then they said, well, listen, anyway, it's not here. We were there. And you have your double taxation, so it's nothing to do with us. You cannot tax us for something that we did over there. It's completely illegal. Not only was this a big issue in Davos and places where you would expect, it became a big issue in all of the governments that would potentially be associated with it. So, Jose Antonio made the point that governments should be encouraged not to go out there and protect their companies who are trying to save taxes. Well, Mr. Cameron spoke to then Mr. Manmohan Singh and said, what are you doing? This is not done. He subsequently spoke to Mr. Modi, who has been more amenable, and the Indian government has 1 month ago agreed to drop this case. So, in fact, there is absolutely no possibility now of recovering this 1.4 billion. This is just one of the many examples. But the reason it dropped this case is not just because of the pressure, but because of fear of other multinationals who all started saying, we can't go to a country where there is all this uncertainty about the tax regime, where we might actually have to pay taxes for what we do, And therefore, if you're going to do this, we refuse to come. So for all developing countries, it has to be a global system. We can't do it alone. There's no way. It has to be a global system. And I think, therefore, initiatives like this are absolutely critical because, let's face it, the OECD thing, I don't think, at least in the developing world, really nobody has any hope in it. Maybe there is some hope, I don't know. But the perception in the developing world is that that's not going to go anywhere. There's no traction there. So we must create, I would say, a broader movement for, yes, tax justice, tax efficiency, but also for the minimum resources required to achieve minimum development. You can't do any of those other big things you're planning to do globally if you don't provide those minimum resources. And I think that's the critical point that we have to drive home everywhere. Final point, the politics of this. I mean, it's good to say we have to do this. We know how hard it is to persuade governments. But I think there's one other reason why we can't persuade governments, and that also was mentioned by both Eva and Jose Antonio, which is that, there is, if you like, the fear of the next election. So I think, the reform, or not the reform, just ensuring that companies pay taxes has to go with some reform of campaign finance. I know, pipe dream 1, pipe dream 2, but in a sense, these are linked pipe dreams, okay? And maybe when you link them, they can do a little tango together and get something going, I don't know. But I do believe that without an adequate reform of campaign finance, which looks further and further away in the US, but maybe in other countries we can do some of it, we are unlikely to have the political power to achieve it even in a very minor way at the national level. Thank you very much.